In this tutorial, I want to show you how I set up possession something else and then going back to the Lyra character. This took a lot of learnings with the way Lyra is set up and having the ability component on the player state, and also the pawn cosmetics had some assumptions, but I really wanted to share this approach because it worked for me. There's just one caveat, is that your player is pretty much impervious when they're possessing a car. And as next step, you could have them be in the car, attached to it. Yeah, and there's also another approach to possession in Lyra that I will link in the description about input forwarding. Full disclosure, I haven't tried that one yet, but I just wanted to make sure that it was possible to possess something else as though it was a regular Unreal project. So yeah, it also works on client. First, open up your project, and let's just make sure that the project always opens with the map, so we don't have to always navigate to it. So open up your project settings, and then under maps and modes, go to the editor startup map, and instead of the default editor overview, we're going to just choose the car map. So next time we open the editor, it will automatically open to the car map. Okay, let's just close that. And for this time, I'm just going to go to the recent levels and open up the car map. Okay, and I'm just going to load in the world partition the region. All right, that's right. I was doing a thumbnail and I was capturing the scene without the landscape. So I just need to go to show, landscape, and grid. And I think that's pretty much it. So we're going to drag in the two cars so that our two players can possess them. And so I'm going to search for off-road. All right, so this is our pawn. Yeah, so I'll just drag this in. Just close enough so that the player doesn't have to walk too far. And then I'm going to drag another one. All right. And then we're going to change our game mode, or we're going to change our default gameplay experience so that it's back to the one that spawns the mannequin, or Manny and Quinn. And okay, we're going to choose shooter game elimination. So shooter game elimination. Okay, that took a little while. So now when we play, we'll be Manny or Quinn. And you'll notice that a lot of other enemies are spawning, kind of the same deal as my other tutorials. So I'm going to stop. Oh, and there's also an error warning about the chaos wheel movement component. So yeah, let's take care of that first. All right. So just going to take that out of there. Okay, so it access none for the movement component for the set angular damping. So for now, I'm just going to add a is valid check. So if your movement is valid, there you go. And if we play again, I'm going to pause. Okay. No more error, so that's good. Okay, so one thing I want to do is I want to disable the AI spawning just for the sake of testing this map and testing possessing a car and a player. So go ahead and open editor preference, and then under Lyra developer setting, you can override the number of player bots to spawn to 0. And then this time around, I'm going to actually set it as default, so it won't reset every time I open up the editor. So I'm going to update the default settings, yes. And okay, yes, this is good. So if you check this into revision, of course, the other developers that are also using your source control will get this change, and it might not be what you want. So I recommend just setting it as writable and not checking it in. Cool. So now if I play, is just my two players, which is what we want. The next thing we want to do is we want to create pads that the player can just go on, and as soon as they overlap with those pads, they possess the cars. So that would be pretty useful for, let's say, a drone or something where your character is not in the vehicle. And it'll be our next step in pretty much having the player in the car. So let's go ahead and use what we already have in Lyra. So let's search for the effect pad. So those are usually the ones that damage you, heal you, etc. in the test maps. So we are going to recycle this and use it for our own purposes. So I'm going to, I think it's this, oh yeah, child healing force feedback. So the gameplay effect pad is the one we want. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on it and just duplicate. And okay, and I'm going to call this one just BP possess car pad. Oh, and I need to change that behavior. So if you want your windows to not dock into this main window, you can set your editor preferences, and then let's choose the last dock window or a new window. Okay. So that should help us. Okay. And you'll notice that whenever you duplicate something, when you're searching for something, it will essentially paste it in whatever folder you were in. So let's just make sure that this is at a location that makes sense. So you can right click, go to folder. So in our case, it actually is in a good spot. So content, environments, gameplay. But if you paste something in your, let's say, at the content root, it will actually paste it not beside the object that was duplicated, but in the content folder all the way up that hierarchy. So anyways, let's go ahead and double click on your possess car pad. Okay. And so we don't really care about the gameplay effect that's applied. We're going to change this later. But for now, as a first step, let's just drag in these pads to a location so that the players can just walk in them. So I'm going to move the players a little bit out of the location. So I'm just going to drag this one in, move it a little bit more, and move this car a little bit more. Okay, so we actually want this to just say possess car, so it's more clear what it does in the level. Let's just make this a little bigger. Okay, so the only one we want to keep is the pretty much if it's none of these, it just still creates a dynamic material instance. So we want to keep this, but everything else can go. So I'm just going to drag this one here, and I'm going to go ahead and delete everything else. So goodbye. Okay. I'm going to compile and save. So you'll notice it just changes to a black color. And another thing we want to do is we want to give it the text. You can go to the text render component, and then let's just change this one to possess car. Awesome. So now we have two pads to possess the cars. They don't do anything yet, but they are ready for gameplay. The next thing we want to set in these pads is have a variable for which car do we want to possess when we overlap. So let's go ahead and create a new variable, and I'll call this one other pawn to possess. So click the plus beside the variables and then call this other pawn to possess Okay, and then this one it'll be just a pawn object reference. Okay, and then I'll compile. And in the details panel, let's just make sure that it is instance editable so that each of these pads can set their pawn to possess. Okay, so let's compile and save. So now when you click on your pads in the details panel, you'll have the option to set the other pawn to possess. So what's nice about this is you can actually pick the actor from the scene. So if you click this and you click the car, it will set it to that car. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other pad. So pick actor from scene and then this car. Okay, so now this one has a reference to that one and this one has the reference to that one. So whatever logic we do in this blueprint will be whichever one is set in the instance in the level. Okay, so now let's actually use that actor reference to possess it. So go ahead and open up or just move up your possess card pad. And then in the event graph, I'm just going to maximize this because it's a little hard to see. Yeah, so whenever you begin the overlap, I can delete all of this because we're not going to be applying a gameplay effect. So I'm just gonna remove that. Okay, so whenever something overlaps you, first we want to make sure that they are in fact a Lyra character. We don't want a car to possess another car. We could add even more checks just to make sure they're a player character. First we need to get its controller. Because it's the control that possesses things. Okay, so we got the controller. So on overlap, we will possess the pawn that we just set up. So I'm just going to drag it up all the way over here. Okay, and then let's play and we'll see what happens. Okay, so when I go in, I possess the car, and you'll see in a Lyra project this happens. So you can see the floating gun. It's essentially there is a player there, but their cosmetics are set to false. You can move the car and everything because we set that up in the previous tutorial. But there's no way yet to return to your previous character. Let's go ahead and add a input for unpossessing the car. So I'm going to just move that over. And then let's navigate to input action, any of them really. So let's navigate to content, vehicle template, input actions. And then I'm going to just duplicate the toggle camera. And I'll name this one input action repossess player. Okay, I'm just going to double check everything's all good. Yeah, so whenever a press happens. So sweet. And let's see where that toggle camera is set up. Okay, so it's in the input mapping context car. So Control E to open it up. And let's add this mapping to our car. So I'm just going to add input action, and it's possess or repossess. There you go. Repossess player. And I'm going to set it to backspace, I think. I think it's not utilized anywhere. And okay, and I could also set it on the controller, but I'm just going to concentrate on just the keyboard inputs. Okay, and then let's go ahead and bind that input inside the off-road car. So I'm going to search for off-road. Okay, so there's our pawn. We might as well just keep it open. Okay, and those are all the inputs. So I'm going to add Oh, first I'm gonna move this logic down. So I'm going to add the binding here. So enhance repossess player. And it's this one. So we need to know which pawn possessed us. So let's actually go ahead and create a custom event for setting that. Okay, so custom event, and then set pawn that possessed me. And in the inputs, let's add a Lyra character reference. I'll call this one Lyra pawn that possessed me. Okay, compile. And I will promote this to a variable. So Lyra pawn that possessed me. Okay. I had a bunch of spaces and it insists on keeping them. So sometimes what I do, if it's a case change, I usually just add a 1 save and then I remove the 1. And it usually keeps the capitalized letters. The custom event does add the spacing to make it more readable, and that is pretty nice. Okay. So whenever you have this input, so whenever it's triggered, we want to repossess the player. So we're going to create another custom function. So I'm just going to move this all down. And then let's create a new custom event. Oh. And then set pawn, repossess player. Okay, so this one will be executing on the server. So essentially we're just setting up, if you're a client and you press your key, your backspace key to repossess the player, we want to make sure that that event is called on the server. So we're going to run on server, compile. All right, so let's do a switch on authority to know are we the client or are we the server? So if we do have authority, we can already call whatever logic is in the repossess player. If we don't, then we do call this server RPC. So let's go ahead and call repossess player. All right, and we'll just go ahead and move this over there just to organize it a little better. So on repossess, we want to get the controller from the pawn, and then we want to possess the player. So let's go with possess the Lyra pawn that possessed me. Okay, so you'll see this symbol. So this only executes on the server anyways. Yeah, and then after we set that up, we can reset our Lyra pawn that possessed me. And so if we're authority, we can just call straight away this logic. Okay, I'm going to compile and save. And now we actually need someone to call this set pawn that possessed me. So that will actually be on in the possess car pad. Oh, I have 3 S's, I just noticed. I'm going to go navigate to it and fix that. All right. Okay. So whenever you possess this car, first of all, well, let's just make sure that we are on authority. Okay, so Lyra Character, switch, oops. Okay, so switch has authority. So if we have authority, we're going to call that function from the other pawn to possess. So set pawn, we won't actually find that function because this is just a pawn. So let's actually change the variable type to off-road car. Off-road car pawn. So object reference is good, and then changing the variable type should be all good. Okay, and now we should be able to set pawn that possessed me. And the pawn that possessed me is this Lyra character that overlapped with me. Okay, and then possess. So yeah, that looks good. Yeah, let's go ahead and test this out. Okay, so on the server, I possess this, and then when I backspace, I go back to my player, and then you'll notice that the car runs off, so because we didn't stop the movement. And you'll notice we can't do much with our player. So the client, you notice that you can't even control this car at all. So I'm just going to stop this. So the problem is that it accessed none while trying to add the mapping context. To fix that, I did write myself a note, and okay, I'm just going to move this over. So let's just go ahead and cast this to player controller. Okay, and let's add a variable to our client add input mapping context. So it wasn't actually getting the local viewing player controller because this isn't the right controller yet. There's some timing issue between possessing a pawn, so we're just going to make sure that we have the right controller. So whenever we're possessed, we send this over to the client, which also has their own version of the player controller. So let's just go ahead and click on this one. Let's click on that one and add an input for a player controller. So Lyra, it could just be a player controller. Okay, and we'll call this one new controller. Okay, so we can hook this into the new controller, and then so our client add input mapping context can use this value. And so first of all, let's test that this works. So let's play and try it on the client to possess the car. Okay, so I'm going to go here. Sweet, I'm possessing the car, and my pawn is still running off. Goodbye, pawn. But yeah, if you press the backspace, you'll be back at your pawn at the location it was. So the next part we're going to fix is just make sure that there's no more movement on the pawn or the vehicle when we unpossess. So let's start with the off-road pawn. So in the event where the player is repossessed, let's just go ahead and drag this vehicle movement component. And you can drag off the pin and then stop movement, or stop active movement. Okay, so this will stop the car, at least. Okay. And then for the player, you can navigate to the possess car pad. And then after possessing, we stop the active movement of the player. So I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. There you go. And okay. And then this here, we want to get the character movement. So with the character movement, we're going to disable movement. So this will make movement impossible, which is what we want. This also needs to be called on the client. So I'm just going to skip all these things, but go straight to the disabling the movement. Okay, let's see if that worked. Okay, so if I play on the client, okay, seems like their movement stopped. That's good. If I stop, if I leave, okay, the movement continues on the client. So let's just make sure that the client also calls to stop the active movement. We could probably get away with stopping the active movement right on this input action. So let's try that out actually. Or just to make sure that they're on possess and there's no more inputs, let's just call it right after we call the repossess player server call. So let's try that again. Okay, so I possess the car, I let go. Okay, so both those didn't seem to work. So maybe the car is still receiving inputs. So let's go ahead and remove the input mapping context on repossess the player. Let's get the player controller from object. So this self. Okay. And then let's get the enhanced input local player subsystem. And let's go ahead and remove the mapping context. And that's the car. And hopefully that will do it. Okay. I'll just reorganize a little bit. Okay, let's compile and save. And let's see what happens. Okay, so I go. And it keeps going somehow. I've added a link to the issue about the movement not stopping on unpossess a chaos vehicle in the description. Okay, let's first try to figure out how to fix that our players, you can't do anything with them after they're repossessed. So this will require some code change. So I'm going to go ahead and open Writer. For you, it might be open Visual Studio. Also, just make sure to save your map. Once the IDE opens, so Visual Studio or Writer, just go ahead and navigate to your Lyra character. Mine is still processing all the engine files. Yeah, so go over here. So this one, whenever I open a file, it'll show up the whole path here. Okay, so go ahead and navigate to, so it's Alt backspace for me. So on it and destroy. So this is the function that told me more about what is happening and when the only time the ability system is uninitialized. So whenever your pawn dies, it detaches from the controller and it uninitializes the ability system and it sets itself to hidden. But whenever possessing another pawn, the ability system is on the player state. So in the case of games where you want to possess a bunch of other things and keep the previous possessed pawn alive and make it possible to go back to it, it might be better to actually use the Lyra character with abilities. But that makes it a little bit more tricky dealing with death and respawn and persistence in abilities. But yeah, in our case, just as a nice step, we'll just make sure that whenever you possess something else, you uninitialize the ability system, uh, which kind of means that your player will be invulnerable when they're unpossessed, and they won't be able to be killable. But that, with the other type of Lyra character, probably involves a tremendous amount of effort, because there's a lot of things in Lyra that rely on having the ability system on the player state. And even the cosmetics rely on one controller per cosmetic on the pawn. But so we'll make it work so that you can reinitialize the ability system when you come back to your player. And let's just pretend this pad is the invulnerability pad and you're protected while you're in it. And when you exit the car, that's when you start to be vulnerable again. Okay, so let's just add a function close to init and destroy. And what I like to do is I like to wrap any code changes around with @game change. So the name of my game, so that whenever I take the Lyra updates, I know which code was mine and what I changed. So yeah, so this is our uninitialized ability system component function. I press Alt Enter just to generate the function body. I will wrap this one also. So I'm just copying from my code, which I will put on GitHub. Okay, so on initialize ability system, it pretty much just does the same logic. Okay. And then where we handle the input, that one took me a little bit of a while. But yeah, I took example from it and I created a function so that will reset the player input after unpossess. Yeah, navigate to Lyra hero component. And then close to is ready to bind inputs. So that's where all the grain framework, like the different states for the actor, that's what I was looking into, but I couldn't figure it out. If someone finds a solution with this, please share. Yeah, so I'm going to just paste this function. So reset player input after unpossess. So that's what we're going to call from our pad, just to make sure that there's no input going to the player. Okay, and I'm going to generate the function and wrap it around with this here. Okay. And paste everything inside. So yeah, this logic is very similar to what the pawn does when it's ready for gameplay and ready to bind inputs. So I'm just going to search for the other usages of this initialized ability system. So this is essentially a big part of the logic that happens when this hero component handles its state, when the data is available and it wants to have its data initialized. So that's when it has the pawn data and it initializes the ability system and the ability input. The player input. I don't really handle the camera mode or the UI, mostly just the inputs, because that was the trickiest part for sure. So yeah, this is pretty much this logic here, but we are kind of forcing it because we already know we have our pawn data ready. So I'm just going to go back. So this, yeah, it's, and it just needs to call to set this ready to bind inputs to false, because this is used in the initialize player input. It just ensures that it wasn't it wasn't ready to bind the inputs yet. Another detail to note is that all the player input are actually cleared in the initialized player input, so we won't have it twice. Okay, so let's actually use these functions we created in our blueprints so that we can use them and the input would work correctly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close my Unreal. Okay, and then I'm going to run from this IDE. So development editor is good. And then I'll change it to Lyra Possess car. And let's go ahead and run. And I pasted an extra bracket. So I'm going to delete that and debug again. Okay, so back again. Let's actually start using our new functions that we made. So navigate to first navigate, or you can click on the possess car and just click on edit the blueprint. Okay. And so after we set the pawn that possessed me, let's just drag that out and other pawn. Okay. And from the Lyra character, let's just make sure that we initialize the ability system component. Okay, so initialize. Okay. Because after we possess this pawn, the player state will now be bound to the car, and the car doesn't have an ability system. So that's the one that we just wrote. It just initializes the ability system, and it clears all the ability input, removes the cues. And we needed this because the way this pawn extension handles the controller changing is that it kind of relies on the new actor to have an ability system. So for now, I unhook the initialize ability system component just to show why we're even calling it. So I put a breakpoint in code. So I'm going to unmute my breakpoint because I do want to see what happens here when the controller changed. Okay, so if I go to the pad, okay, so it calls refresh ability actor info because the new pawn didn't actually have an ability component. So this kind of relies on the new pawn having one, but if you don't want one, you might as well just make sure that your current pawn has its ability system initialized so that the ability inputs won't be there and you'll run into less issues. But again, this would be a different process if the Lyra character had its own ability system and the ability system didn't live on the player state. So yeah, so this is why we need to call initialize ability system. So I'm just gonna go back to the game. Don't need this anymore. And I'll stop. And there you go. Okay, and then we need something to tell it to reinitialize. So that was the other function that we created. So that one we need to actually put in the logic of the car. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up our off-road car pawn. And so where we want to put this, we want to put this in the repossess player. So after we repossess the player, we want to make sure to pretty much refresh the ability system and rebind all the inputs. So I'm going to drag off the Lyra pawn that possessed me and then find its hero component. And then I'm going to call reset player input. Oop. Okay, so after we possess the player, we make sure we reset their input after being unpossessed. Okay, and then let's play and see how that works. Okay, so first let's try with the client. Okay, so I am a car. And then when I depossess, you'll see that now you can move, but the pawn isn't ready. Let's try with the server. Okay. And then backspace. So they spawn in correctly. But you'll see there's some issue with the cosmetics, and they didn't really reset. But after you die, it should be fine. Okay, so the last piece of this puzzle is we have to handle saving the cosmetics and basically just making sure they don't get set to be invisible. Okay, so I will stop this and I will open up back up our writer. Okay, so let's go ahead and search for character parts. Okay, so Lyra, how it works is that they have this controller component for character parts, and then they have these pawn component for character parts. So the pawn keeps track of the spawned character parts, while the controller character parts, it keeps track of the list of the parts, and pretty much updating beyond death, or in our case, possession. But it seems to rely on basically if you unpossess, it wants to remove these parts. But then when you get repossessed, it re-adds them. So we'll just add some logic so that our pawn component doesn't hide its character parts when you're unpossessed. But when they're repossessed, the controller component will get back that list of character parts. Or sorry, it will have that same list, but it will get back the references of the actual spawn character parts, so it doesn't try to spawn them again. Okay, so first let's go to the Lyra pawn component character parts. Okay, I'm going to go to the header file. And so there's a get character parts actor. Okay, sweet. So there's a functionality to get all the part actors, but there's no functionality to get a specific character part, which we will need soon. So here you can paste my code that I have for this part. So right under get character parts, let's just go ahead and paste this. Okay, and I just made sure to keep them all together so it's just one chunk. Yeah. So it'll be a function just to get the entry and to set it to not hide. So maybe I could rename this, but I'll keep it the way it is. So set keep pawn cosmetics on unpossess. So this will make sure that they stay alive and they stay there invisible. Okay. So the other one we need to copy is this get entry. So that is in the Lyra character part list. Okay. And then you can paste this under the remove entry. Okay, so get entry. So from this will be like the controller will be asking about this part. Okay, so generate definition. And I will surround that also. Okay. So this one, it just iterates through the entries and it gets the character part with the, it returns the handle for that character part. Okay. And I will probably start another tab. Let's just open up our Lyra controller component character parts. Okay, so I'll put this one to the right. Okay, so this one. So we need to change the functionality for when it possesses, just to change how it behaves. So Control A to go to the C++, and let's navigate to unpossess pawn changed. Okay, and I'm just going to paste the entirety of the function I put in there. If you have some logic that is a little bit different, don't paste it all. Just keep yours also. But yeah, so the biggest difference is, I guess I could just do a diff. Okay, so local history. I don't have revision control for this, but the writer has local history, which is nice. Okay. So what this used to do is whenever the possess pawn changed on the character parts on the controller component, it would essentially remove all the character parts and reset the handle. So you lose any reference you had from the pawn character parts component. And then if you, and then you'd apply the character parts defined in the list on the controller to the pawn, Lyra pawn component character parts. So essentially all I did is that if you don't want to keep your cosmetics on unpossessed, then yes, you can remove the character parts. And then you still reset the handle, that's okay. And then if you don't have an old pawn, then just make sure to still reset all the entry handles, because it won't reach this part here, because the if there's no old pawn, then there's no pawn component. Yeah, and then the biggest difference for applying to the new pawn is that if you want to keep the pawn's cosmetic on unpossessed, instead of adding a new character part to your new customizer, you just get the part that already exists. So then your controller's array will, or your controller's parts list will be aware that it already has a handle for this part because it already existed. And then at the end, I just make sure to set that to false. So let's say you die, you do want your cosmetics to disappear. This one also took me a while to just make sure your character is visible. All right, I'm going to close this. Now we just got to make sure that we call that we want to keep the cosmetics before we possess the next pawn. Okay, so I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop this and make sure that I save these. Okay. And then I'm going to rerun. Okay, so we are back. And so we want to make sure that we keep our pawn cosmetics on unpossessed. So let's go ahead and open up the possess car pad. And then right after this node, you can add our new function call. So from our player controller, or not player controller, from our player character, let's get the component by class. And then this will be our Lyra pawn component character parts. So let's just inform our pawn component that we want to actually keep our cosmetics when we unpossess. So set keep pawn cosmetics on unpossessed. Okay, so We want to keep them, yes. Naming is hard again. And let's compile and see what happens. Okay, so I go in there. Yay! It stays there. Looks like the client is still thinking that it's running in its animation blueprint, which is interesting. Yeah, but our server is fine. Sweet. And then when you go backspace, the only issue is that it thinks it respawned. So that's our last little bit that we will do for this tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And what we're going to do is we're going to stop that spawn effect from happening with a tag. So let's go back to our writer. And in our new function, reset player input after unpossess. Okay. So in there, let's just add a loose gameplay tag and then remove it after we initialize the ability system. Because that's when the gameplay effect spawn is applied on spawn. In the right after the right after this line. Okay, so we set this loose gameplay tag, and then right after we remove it. Okay, so I found that this worked pretty well. If I didn't remove it, essentially when they died and respawned, they wouldn't play it again, because that tag would always be there until the end of the game, pretty much. Yeah, so I'm going to create this variable. I'm just going to navigate to it, and I'm going to add this tag. Let's put it close to this state because it has to do with it. So yeah, it would be even better if we could tie in this repossess state into the initializing state. But again, way above my understanding at the moment. So in our gameplay tag C++, let's just find that one. So it was here. Okay. So I just pasted from the GitHub. Yeah, so target has repossessed, not died. Don't play the Spawn VFX. Pretty much is all we're telling it to do. Okay. Now we have a new tag. Great. Okay, and then run again. So I could have done live coding, but because I was doing a lot of header file modification, I find it safer and better to just run from code every time. All right. So let's go ahead and find the spawn effect. So GA spawn effect. Okay. You'll see that its activation happens on spawn, so that's why it happens when the ability system is reinitialized. So let's go ahead and add an activation blocked tag for repossessed. Okay, and let's play. All right, so I possess the car. I unpossess the car. I'm not spawning back in. I can do it again with a different car. Repossessed. And then I'll try with the client. All right. So that's good. Yeah, now it's possible to possess something else and have your Lyra characters still exist in cosmetics and be able to repossess them after possessing something else. So yeah, next step could be to essentially add the overlap on the car itself, and then when you overlap, your player gets parented to the car, and maybe make them sit in their animation graph. But yeah, this video was it was a lot of learning, and it's useful for anything like drones or mini cars, etc. And it's really cool to be able to walk and see your previously possessed pawn. So yeah, thanks for watching.